Welcome back on Blockchain Rock. Today with us, we have a very special guest. We have John Shaw. John, thank you so much for coming on Blockchain Rock. John is a practitioner in London. He's a lawyer, and more specifically, is an intellectual property lawyer. And he's here today to speak a bit about the overlap, or let's say the synergies between blockchain and intellectual property rights. Not only that, we'll also go, into other technologies, such as, for example, augmented reality, which is a technology that both John and I are very, very excited about, especially when we're considering IP. So, John, I'll give you the floor if you want to introduce yourself a little bit. And again, thank you so much for coming today on Blockchain Rock.
No, thank you so much for having me on, Maria. I'm a big fan of the podcast and
Thanks.
listen to you a lot. So it's a real pleasure for me to be on here. Just a bit of background about me. As you say, I'm an IP enthusiast and a real sort of tech enthusiast, and particularly emerging tech enthusiast. So I got involved or got interested really in tech just after I graduated from uni on the Obama campaign in 2012 to re-elect President Obama. And my role there, we were sort of using data and some personal data, but also using data to really inform decision-making on the campaign and sort of help people vote and help people know where to vote and sort of encourage them to vote. And that experience really sort of galvanized my interest in the use of data for campaigns, and it was really great to see the positive use of data.
That's really interesting because, of course, apologies if I interrupt you, but I think I have a question because it's quite interesting. Of course, now, there has been a lot of attention as to, the use of data, perhaps also unauthorized, and for uses which are, questionable. But so when you say that, this experience that you've had, which, by the way, is incredible, sounds incredible, working on an Obama campaign, how has it sparked your interest? Were you concerned about the use of data? Were you impressed by the potential that data holds in order to, and it's different uses, including also, of course, the greater good? But of course, it's a controversial aspect because from your point of view, I guess that electing Obama was for the greater good because you believe that his political agenda was to the benefit of a country, but other people, people that support the opposition might have seen that in a different way. So how has it sparked your interest? In what way?
So the reason it really sparked my interest was how it sort of made decision-making more efficient. And so previously, decision-making was always done, on gut feeling. And I think when, and people's sort of experience.
Or small samples, right? They would take 20 people.
Samples. And it was really interesting to see the leadership team sort of say, look, we're relying on this, relying on the data, and the data is going to inform our decision-making. And we know the data is very reliable because we've sort of given people a questionnaire and they've freely responded to it. They know they're talking to the Obama campaign when they fill it out. It was sort of very transparent. And I think the campaign was very transparent in sort of the data it collected from individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'd call people and they were sort of saying, I was expecting your call and, I thought I'd hear, and, I was expecting to hear back in 12 hours because that's what they would say. And
how did they react when you had an English accent?
So so they thought it was the most bizarre thing for a Brit to go and help.
You must have played a big part in his victory.
But it turns out, as the campaign went on, there were more and more people from Europe, and so there was like a Swedish contingent, and we came across some French nationals and German nationals. So,
oh wow!
It was really interesting to see a sort of. Coalition of the.
How come? Is it is it sort of an experience for a graduate that allows you to gather useful experience for work? How is it a scheme?
No. So it was all very separate. It was just like-minded people, I suppose, from those interested in politics in their countries, and then they just went to work on the campaign to gain a bit of campaign
involved.
Experience. And get involved in. and yeah, in a great experience. So it was thrilling to see the use of technology in what I guess a sort of a sort of an industry which previously I wouldn't have sort of connected
Yes.
with tech, use of tech. So um,
Yeah, fair
that
enough.
was
I see.
yeah, that was really really interesting. So
Yeah,
I
it's not
thought, well,
obvious, I guess.
yeah,
Mm.
so I thought so I came away from that thinking, oh, I really love to keep working in, with tech companies and with and particularly emerging tech and the use of sort of, yes, statistics and data. And
Yeah.
I was able to work for a very short time in a law firm, and we worked on some intellectual property issues to do with there was a set of relaxation chambers, and that again you sort of used personal data to inform the decision making of within the sort of the chamber of what colors and what music to use and what the sort of the relaxation experiment. Um, and then after that, I worked at a small time in the strategy team for a Magic Circle firm
Hmm.
on a project related to artificial intelligence and how law firms use artificial intelligence, but also how their clients are using artificial intelligence and the sort of the state of the art and what the legal implications of artificial intelligence will be. And all those sort of experiences made me think, well, I'd love to go and work on the legal issues. And being an
Oops.
intellectual property
Apologies.
lawyer, and being an
Sorry.
intellectual property lawyer, those are, being an intellectual property lawyer was the sort of the way to do that. And the sort of, I think the key issues with emerging tech are related to personal data for sure, because a lot of people are saying that data is the new gold. I think,
Of course.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
the new no the new oil, the
Which.
new oil.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And but I also think that the intellectual property issues are just as pertinent, and that was what I sort of always tried to do. And I trained as a lawyer, and now sort of 2 years into my career, qualified. So and that's what I love to do. Love to sort of work with emerging tech companies and sort of really grapple with those questions. And that's
And
fortunately what we were able to do on the Tech London Advocate blockchain
exactly. I wanted to fast forward from
report.
your experience in the
Yes,
campaign, and now you've been involved and you work together with other lawyer in conjunction with other lawyers in
yeah,
drafting the blockchain, right? Distributed ledger technology guide for the Law Society, correct?
yes, that's
In
right.
England, for England and Wales, which, from what I understand, I mean, I reviewed it, is a guide for legal practitioner in understanding the different implication of blockchain that blockchain technology has on the different areas of law. And you've been
Yeah,
involved particularly on the intellectual property matters, which I'm really excited about, because I think that there is such a great potential for blockchain in the field of the digital property and ownership of intellectual property right, which at present I think
yeah,
is imperfect, because of course you need to go effectively, you need to go to court to enforce your intellectual property right, and at present there are just intangible rights. But if you were to implement a solution on the blockchain, from what I understand, you would end up with always a digital project, but which feels much more real, because you'd be able to trade it, you'd be able to
yeah.
limit its use, you'd be able to do so much with it. So uh, can you take us through a few of the challenges and the opportunities that you were able to explore uh, through the
Yeah.
drafting of this guide?
Well, yeah. So we approached the guide, and I wrote my section with two brilliant lawyers, Rosie Burbage and Charlie Lyons Rothbart, and they're both fantastic. And I should say thank you very quickly to Anne Rose, because she gave me the opportunity to participate, because she was the author of part and editor of the whole report. But we really looked at the way that blockchain would fit within the intellectual property rights system that currently exists. And I
Mhm.
think one of the topics that's just talked about a lot with blockchain and intellectual property is how it can be used as a sort of digital rights management tool. And it's really useful in that way. That's a huge utility. You could imagine a very, very good system of distributing royalties, for example,
Exactly, I was about to
in the
ask,
music
but
industry. And that
that
sort of
would.
happened. Imogen Heap is a great artist, and
Mhm.
she's already she's really the forerunner of utilizing blockchain to make sure artists sort of receive, they sort of cut out the middleman and the artist receives.
Exactly, because what would happen then to collecting societies? They would disappear effectively.
Yeah, so then there's, if blockchain becomes the way that
Yeah,
music is consumed and distributed, then yes, then the collection society, there's questions about the role for those.
yeah, maybe managing, because
Um,
one, like, to badge into what you were saying, a lot of time, especially if you look at the financial services industry, for example, the use of cryptocurrencies and the use of blockchain technology was always hailed as potentially an alternative to the standard
yeah,
banking system and all of the financial services industry. However, from what we see, really, you don't really end up cutting out the middleman. You end up providing more control, but really then through regulation, through the necessary need of having banks, because still our
yeah,
system relies on them. It's not like you're going to cut current player, but instead current players are going to adopt this technology to make their services more efficient, which I don't see as a bad thing necessarily. I think that, for example, if you're a musician, many musicians do not even understand what's going on in the back end and why they're able to get paid, although it's questionable
yeah.
how much you get paid.
You're right. One of the real utilities of sort of blockchain technology and distributed ledger technology is that you should be able to see the royalties very clearly, and sort of who gets what very
Yes,
clearly, because you would have a series of smart contracts that sort of very clearly distributes the, whatever it could be. It could be Ether, it could be Bitcoin, it could be any sort of cryptocurrency.
yeah, maybe
The
stable coins as well. Or have you seen,
Yeah.
like, there has been now a new, recently actually, I think the European Union was considering releasing a form of crypto asset representing the euro. I'm not sure if it's very speculative at the moment, but
Yeah,
if
so that
that
would be
if that
interesting.
exact yeah, exactly, because then you would use effectively current fiat money would basically upgrade themselves and
Yeah.
take this new form, and then that could be integrated across all
And so,
blockchain.
do you think the uptake of that from a person on the street would actually would actually happen? I think it could, because when somebody said to me, "Okay, well, look, you used to have notes in your wallet, but now you have numbers on the screen. You've got
Exactly.
digital online banking. It's all the
Yeah,
same.
I don't see a problem, I
Why
think.
don't you use
Yeah,
that?" And I sort of think, yeah, okay,
yeah,
and so I
exactly,
trust. So if you were to introduce if you were to sort of the user experience, I think if the user experience isn't so different,
exactly, and actually
then
can be improved.
and
If you
can be,
think
it can
about
be,
it,
it's
it
more
can be improved.
reliable,
So
yeah,
yeah,
less
I think
susceptible to hacking. Sure.
yeah, exactly, I agree with you. I think that the end user might not necessarily appreciate what goes on in the back end, but I don't see the everyday user as a barrier, to
Mm,
this form of, like, a nationwide crypto asset being established.
yeah.
I
So
just see, yeah, I don't
that's one
see
of
that.
the
Mm,
yeah. Well, sorry, what I was going to say is, well, that's one of the
sure.
interesting things also about blockchains. You can have the closed and the open
Yes,
chains
exactly. You can
themselves.
tailor you can tailor a
To
distributed ledger according to your preference. Everyone always
Yeah,
thinks about the Bitcoin ledger, so
yeah.
distributed, public, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you can have also private ledgers, so you can customize it to your needs.
And so it'd be interesting to see which of those two systems sort of has greater
Will be
uptake. So
adopted. Yeah,
yeah, because you're right. The sort of the original idea was to have everything distributed, and so you
yeah,
trust the system, you don't trust an intermediary. Um, but if for example, a collection society said, okay, well, look, actually, we've got a closed ledger which is very secure, but we'll run it and we'll operate it and we'll remain a collecting society.
exactly. Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
think if that's adopted, even though it sort of undermines the whole utility
The
of
potential of the technology. Yeah, no, I
yeah,
understand. I think, though,
so
I agree with you. I think that actually this view that you're taking will effectively be the one that, I might be wrong. Like 10 years from now, I
mm,
might look back at this and be wrong, at this
yeah,
moment. But I do think that, as I said before, with respect to the financial system, to the financial services system, I do believe that rather than cutting out middlemen, I think what happens really is the middleman becomes integrated within the technology. So in the case of collecting societies, they might assume the role of gatekeepers, which
yeah,
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing depending on how it is implemented, because I do think that there is a role for collecting societies, especially after the CSAC case, which allows, from what I remember, for people within the different jurisdiction to choose the collecting society of their preference. Just briefly, like to explain, and this is not my specific area of law, but just to explain briefly what are these collecting society we're referring to. PPL and PRS, which, if I'm not mistaken, now they also merged, right, in the UK. They So basically what happened is artists usually register with them, and they register their copyright, which is not a requirement, but they allow the collecting society to collect money on their behalf when their track is played, in restaurants or in a movie or on an
Yeah.
advert or simply, at a venue. So that's how artists can monetize their right, so the copyright,
Mm.
their song, the rights over their song. And they rely on this framework of collecting societies. And this collecting society were able to evolve themselves into effectively a network whereby if someone plays your track in a different state, let's say in Italy, and you're UK national and you've registered your right with PPL and PRS, you'd still be able to get paid because the collecting society in Italy will collect the money on your behalf, and
Yeah.
liaise effectively with the UK collecting societies to distribute that portion of value to you. It was
Yeah.
just
And
briefly
so
to explain how that works. Yeah.
And so I wouldn't be able to say how long they've been sort of in existence, but
Oof,
it's a
150
very
years, I
long
think.
it's a very long
Yeah.
it's a very old system.
Hmm.
But I read a paper recently that said that it's still possibly probably the most effective way for artists
Yes.
to sort of gain that sort of get that remuneration.
And I agree. And I
Um,
agree with that. At
and
the end
so,
of the day,
and
I was in the creative society before becoming a lawyer, and the reason why I decided to become a lawyer and to study intellectual property and specialize in this area is exactly because of that. Because I've noticed that no one really was concerned, or wanted to understand exactly how the intellectual property right work, which at the time I was only
mm,
familiar with copyright, but I didn't really understand it. And so, like, I was uncomfortable because I thought, most of the artists do not really understand why they're able to monetize. And that's an issue,
yeah,
because then you hear all type of problems. And you know I don't want to generalize, but normally people that are involved in the creative industries are totally absorbed in the process of creating new material. So the fact that there are collecting societies that allow them to almost disregard their entire part, especially the
yeah,
one
and
about
focus
enforcement and
on the
collection,
work.
exactly, and do it on their behalf, I see as a positive, because I've known a few musicians and artists,
Yeah,
I've come to know a few, and I can guarantee you that some of those that I know, for example, would have problem monetizing if it wasn't for this automatic process of distribution. So
yeah.
yeah.
So the technology has a really interesting application there, and we do look at that a little bit in the report. But the main thing we sort of address is the question, is sort of the other side of intellectual property, was what happens if you have, or what are the potentials for intellectual property infringement that sort of utilizes blockchain. So just similarly, how as blockchain would be very good for distributing royalties, it would also be very good for copyright infringement, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because of the decentralized nature, it's very hard to then see who's responsible. And we've already seen in cases like the Pirate Bay, the sort of the use of
Yeah.
decentralized technology, and how it can be very effective for early adopters to sort of receive pirate copies of original work. So we look at that a little bit, and the we sort of look at that to do with copyright. We look at what happens if you have trademark infringement via the platform. We look at whether we discuss whether confidential information could be stored on a blockchain, because you would
That's
have,
interesting.
yeah, you'd essentially have something that's confidential, but actually you're sort of making it available to everybody, and it's only restricted by a key.
You're about the public. You're meaning about on the public
Yeah,
domain.
so if it's on a
Yeah.
public ledger, and then we look at then we'd also discuss whether the intellectual property rights within the technology itself, so the copyright and the code for the blockchain, and so it really just sort of looks at the various issues that are the intellectual property issues that arise, rather than the sort of the way the technology can be utilized, because that was something that I think um, the sort of the discussion around blockchain we thought would really benefit
Yeah,
from
for sure.
that. So
Especially for a legal practitioner, it's understanding where the issues could come
yeah,
from. Yeah, from what I understand, we had an episode. We recorded an episode with the CEO and founder of Library, which is a platform for content sharing, sort of like YouTube, but it is based on blockchain technology. Of course, you
mm,
cannot store videos on the blockchain, especially if it's a public blockchain, a distributed one, because you'd have to download an entire database of video on your computer, which is like
yeah,
basically
very clearly,
unrealistic. So
yeah,
what they did, they only used the blockchain as an index for the videos.
yeah,
And I asked the question of what happened if someone, has some infringing material or even some morally unacceptable material, and the if the distributed ledger is present a characteristic of immutability, such as for example the Bitcoin ledger, then how do you address that? And he said, well, what we do really is we remove the content from the index page, so you won't be able to access it. Which I'm not
yeah,
mistaken, we had the chance to speak about it already before the podcast between the two of us.
yeah.
That's also the sort of solution that you kind of considered, right?
Yeah, so we looked at immutability, and which is one of the sort of the key features of the
Yeah,
technology, and how that really sort of seems at odds with the notice and takedown requirement
yeah,
under the copyright framework. Um, and we came to the same conclusion that Michelle Fink came to in her book relating to GDPR, which was
yes,
that you don't actually have to delete something sort of from the internet to sort of restrict
to
access. You just
comply. Yeah, yeah.
to be comply with and the two regimes are very different. But in order to comply with the notice and takedown regime, it would likely be acceptable just to restrict access to make it impossible
To access it.
impossible
It's
to
not
view.
available to the public anymore, but it's not available
Exactly,
to anyone. But actually,
but
what's
it's still
interesting
there.
is that you mentioned the GDPR and data, because on our second episode of the podcast, that was a long time ago, we had Mihai Vashu, which is the CEO and founder of Modex, a platform for a DApp platform, effectively. And we discussed also GDPR and the immutability of the blockchain, and what that could lead to.
Mm,
And he said that in his opinion, the right to be forgotten would really turn into the right not to be accessed, and that actually the keys to that domain will be hopefully given to the actual users. So for
yeah,
example, with respect to personal data, and so that basically if you were to hold on your wallet, and again it's something that we discussed between the two of us previously, if you were to hold your personal data on your wallet, then you could potentially license it and distribute it only to those parties that you wanted to, and you'd be able to track exactly where it's traveling. And at the same
mm,
time you'd be able to monetize directly from the use of the data, which would be absolutely great, because of course users data is being used, how can I say, it's widely at the present, like
yeah.
by everyone. And as you said, it forms the basis of commerce nowadays, basically all of this data, personal or not, because a lot of time it's being um,
No, exactly.
anonymized. Yeah, exactly. It's
Well, that was one of the things we looked at, and we saw that it would be that in that way what a lot of people have sort of highlighted as a real issue for blockchain and certain regulatory systems. We actually sort of came to the conclusion that the two can coexist quite easily.
yeah,
Um, what's interesting though, talking about your example about how they're using the blockchain to index, there
yes,
would the case the Pirate Bay sort of said that indexing and sort of providing a search function and things like that's sufficient to sort of be liable for communicating to the public and to be liable for copyright infringement.
yeah,
And so the question then comes to who, if the person it places onto the blockchain a
yeah,
link is placing a link, is that sufficient to be liable for copyright infringement? And if so, who's really responsible for that? Because you have,
mm,
yes, the person who places the link, the user accesses the link,
yes,
but then you also have other sort of regulatory access points like the miners and the core software developers who design the
Yeah.
system.
And
And it's
is like when a user downloads the ledger on its computer, is that a new copy? Is that considered a new? Because with hyperlink, for
yeah,
example, that's not the case. If I'm not mistaken, it is
I think
considered to be always the same copy. So
yeah,
would they take a similar approach? Because of course, under copyright law, the more copy you make, the more you're liable in a certain.
yeah.
So,
And
so
so it's not only that, and then also the sort of the court looked at the sort of the reason that um, the links were being placed onto the database. So
yeah.
they're saying where there's a sort of clear intent for for piracy,
Hmm.
then and you're making money from it,
Yes.
there's going to be the assumption that you've got authorization and to do that. And if you
But
don't,
does
then
money have to come? Apologies for budging in. Does money have to come directly from the illicit activity, or for example, what if you're driving traffic to your website and then you're monetizing by way of advert?
yeah, so
Would
then
that be remote
that's
enough? I mean,
exactly. And then would it be sufficient if it was cryptocurrency? Would that be the same?
yeah.
If you had a mining pool and you were generating the sort of cryptocurrency from mining
Hmm.
these for this illicit activity, is that sufficient monetization? So you
Yeah,
could have a
yeah, yeah. I see
situation
what you
where
mean. Does that constitute a form of monetization?
so somebody puts up a link, free access. They're not making any money from it, but it's a sort of a clear copyright infringement
Yeah,
because the film just came out in the cinema, when everyone's allowed back in the cinema.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I see.
Then the miners are the ones who generate the sort of the
Well,
value
if you're
through,
looking at
even though
yeah,
it's very small.
if you're looking at a website, right? Like from what I understand, there is the oh my god, what's the specific name? I can't remember it right now. So if you're an internet service provider, right, you
Mhm.
have the right not to monitor. I don't remember the exact name. So I'll explain it. I don't remember the exact term to refer to this, right? But it would be unthinkable. Nowadays there are so many companies and individuals that provide platforms or a forum online where people can share. So that is user-generated content. Now there is already some form of dilemma. Now it has been addressed already, but it still happens every day. Where people share. For example, think about the social media like Facebook or on YouTube, material which is protected by copyright without authorization. Now
Yeah,
that can be a problem, of course, for someone as big as YouTube and Facebook, or Instagram, for example. Because if you think about the sheer amount of pictures that are shared on Instagram and
mm,
videos that are shared on YouTube every second, it is an incredible number, and it would be unthinkable to have a person monitoring. Here we go. It's a non-obligation to monitor. That's the right term.
right.
It would be unthinkable for the service provider to monitor all of the content, and to an extent, it could also be
Mhm.
said to, I don't know, infringe freedom of speech, because if you're arbitrarily decide that some content is befitting your standard and another doesn't, you can also end up there. But with respect to copyright infringement, you have, or morally unacceptable content, what happened is typically those platforms have the right not to monitor the content. However, they must act within a certain amount of time, usually 15 days, from being, from if someone flags that content as being an infringing content, or a content which does not, befit the moral standards of nowadays society, and so on and so forth. So it could be interesting to see, maybe with respect to the blockchain and the indexing and all of that, they might adopt a similar measure, where, for example, if you're the miner, or if you form part of the miners community, you can decide to fork the like the blockchain or the ledger
Yeah,
that you're
blockchain.
using for that specific purpose, to remove that part of the content. I'm not sure how
Yeah,
practical it would be. Like if you look at how DLTs
yeah,
are fork right now, it's very impractical. But if you design
yeah.
a distributed ledger technology with that in mind, you can make it very agile. And you can actually
Right.
give the power to someone to fork, like I'm not sure, like the court for sure, or like some regulator, to fork it every time and remove every week all content that is deemed infringement. So something like
Yeah,
that could work. I'm not sure. Like but I think it would revolve around the technological
yeah.
solution.
Yeah, that's what the sort of the real blockchain enthusiasts want, isn't it? They're
Yeah.
sort of lex cryptographic, and that sort of thing. And I think the blockchain really can really could be a solution to these things. And I think we sort of come to the conclusion in the report that, as I say, that the sort of the technology can exist within the copyright framework
Yeah.
that currently exists. So why not continue to use it and sort of allow the sort of the law to adapt to it as and when
Yeah, and
needed.
also use cases to evolve, like at the end of the day, also a lot of where things are going to end up depends on the entrepreneur and businesses that will be implementing solution based on blockchain. So I think it's also about
Yeah,
waiting and seeing to an extent before, suffocating any further development by way of regulation. um
yeah, and so that was the sort of the conclusion we came to. And
I see.
it's interesting because some European countries like Malta have taken a sort of a
Hmm.
different approach, and they've sort of
Yeah.
gone straight in with the legislation and have
Yeah.
had bespoke legislation straight away. And so it's
Look,
interesting.
Gibraltar also has bespoke regulation.
Of
Actually,
course,
from what I understand, Malta came up with the whole framework, and they have great marketing. But then I'm not sure. I don't think they have released any license yet. I'm not sure. That's the
is that
latest
right?
that I heard. But they've like studied and implemented to an extent the whole framework. Also, Gibraltar is regulated, for example, the use of distributed ledger technology. But to avoid, suffocating the development of the technology. Uh, the way Gibraltar decided to move is to regulate the providers of DLT technology and not to regulate the technology itself. But again, the target of the
Yeah,
regulation is the provider. So similarly to to traditional financial services regulation, the regulation is in place to protect the end customer, then the consumers, and the reputation of the jurisdiction. So you'd have to go through an exercise of making sure that that the business have internal procedure and measures to safeguard the their customers and the
yeah,
funds that they hold. There are measures in place. So a lot of people think about regulation as, years ago, money grabbing scheme, government is making
yeah,
everything illegal. It depends. It could be implemented in such a way, but it's not always the case. Also, I think regulation can simply assist sometimes businesses understanding where risk can come from and how to mitigate those
yeah,
risks. And if you look at most of the financial services regulation, really is about that. It's a process. And when you look at the fintech space, a lot of entrepreneurs are very young, and so they're very, very versed in on the technical side of things, but they're not experienced entrepreneurs a lot of time. And this process, we've really seen like how quickly entrepreneurs are able to mature, going from the beginning of the application
sure.
to obtaining the authorization from the regulator. It's mind-blowing. They
Yeah,
become familiar with all aspects of running a business, from KYC and AML requirements to GDPR to conflict of interest, and all by way of reviewing the policies together, understand what mechanisms have to be in place. So I did not expect it. For example, I'm new to I was new now. That's really the area in which I work, but that's something that I thought was quite surprising, and I was quite glad to see that it was the case. Because otherwise you wouldn't want regulation if it came at the expenses of technological development and improvement.
well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's the key message from the report as a whole is that the possibilities for this technology are immense. So
Yeah,
and that's what interested me in blockchain
yeah.
in the sort of the first instance. The applications are so immense that it would be a shame to sort of to stifle that sort of innovation.
Exactly,
Um,
especially because most of the potential of technology, in my opinion, come with the convergence of technology. So when new technology get together, and I'll use this as a to jump
yeah,
onto
good
our
segue.
next topic, which we can't wait to speak about it. We had the chance to speak
Yeah,
about it before previously. So of course, augmented reality. So you have
yeah,
the blockchain to underpin your digital asset, and then you have augmented reality to experience them. So just to start, of course, augmented reality is mistakenly assumed to only involve stimulation of your visual senses. So with a filter or
yeah,
on the phone or with glasses, but really the core aspect of the technology is augmenting your reality by stimulating all of your senses. So I know that there are companies that are developing technology to stimulate your sense of taste and your sense of smell and your sense of touch, for example, through the use of suits. So that is extremely exciting.
yeah,
When it comes to technology, you can always be scared and excited. I often happen to be both leaning more toward the excitement camp. But
Yeah, I see. I think that is really exciting. And
it is.
just very quickly on the intellectual property side of things,
Yes.
one of the things that's stopping you know, innovators essentially from registering certain trademarks is because
Hmm.
there's too much subjectivity as to the sort of the stimulation. So there's too much subjectivity in taste, for example,
Yes.
or and so you're unable to sort of, or and that's also I think
Yes.
in copyright. So there was a
To yeah, to
case
have a
in
reference that is universal to everyone. Yeah, that's really
so
interesting.
if those things are going to be sort of sort of essentially overcome by technology, then you might get to a stage where a cheese could be an original work, and
Yes.
the taste of a cheese could be an original work, or the or the
That was
taste
the
of a
problem with color also before
yeah,
before really computer existed. Like actually, let's give you
yeah.
a brief explanation. 'Cause that was the topic of my dissertation for the master in
Oh, really?
intellectual
I didn't-
property. So I'm very excited about the topic.
yeah,
And so lately there has been some form of relaxation, or let's say the scope of what can be accepted as a registered trademark expanded
mm,
because now exotic trademarks, so a trademark which other than graphical element or writings or names, now are also accepted. The problem is, of course, they have to be able to stay within a durable medium, and as you
yeah,
explained, smells and taste would fade over time as a first challenge. As a
yeah,
second one is the subjectivity, of course. So those are the two main challenges that you encounter when you want to register a trademark, so which other than a visual, you know, subject matter. So
yeah,
or a graphical one, which is really interesting because color, for example, presented the same challenge, but then with the use of Pantone and recognized
yeah,
system of classification, they kind of addressed that, and now they're
mm,
trying to find ways to address like these form of how do you store, how can you make sure that, because trademark potentially has the potential to be renewed infinitely, right?
mm,
How do you make sure that something that you register today and the sample that you provide to the intellectual property office through which you register
yeah,
stays the same in 100 years, so that
yeah,
if someone reproduce a similar taste, you can claim that they're infringing, because by the time, imagine
yeah,
if you put a piece of cheese in a fridge in 100 years, it's gonna it's gonna be well and gone. So
yeah,
and yeah, what you say is extremely interesting. Sorry, I wanted to give a bit of
yeah,
background to the listeners. So it's extremely interesting what you say, because by using augmented reality you can effectively reproduce the same stimulation at all time, because it
yeah,
becomes an
exactly.
artificial stimulation. And
Yeah. So
that, yeah, please
no,
please
no. So
take it.
I was going to say, yeah, so that represents like a really it's a really interesting space for intellectual property, and you start to have not only those things like sort of taking things out of the augmented reality, so how it's stimulating you, but also
Yeah.
what you put into it. So what if you create a sculpture in augmented
Yes.
reality, and what happens if you make you have a piece of art in that sort of world, the questions of sort of authorship of that and joint authorship
Yes.
are just really interesting. So I think,
and
yeah, I think
and blockchain, I think, comes in, because the problem is, of course, reproducing a material as it is now for digital files, the control C control V or command C command V. So it's the copy and paste function that creates a problem. But if you have blockchain underpinning the asset, you know that a digital sculpture is as unique as a physical one, because there is only going to be one of them. So that's why technological convergence is so exciting, because when you start considering their technology not in their own capacity, but
yeah,
as a group together, the potential becomes exponential, and that's so interesting.
yeah. I think
Mm.
so. Yeah, I think it's just a really interesting space to be sort of working in, to be experimenting in,
Yeah.
and it'll be really interesting to see, yeah, which are the key players for one sort of trying to protect their trademarks in augmented reality. Whether it's going to remain like for people like who are interested in color, whether it's going to be like the chocolate wars between
Yes. Yeah.
Cadbury's and
Cadbury and yeah.
Cadbury
And
or is it going to be a totally different industry? That I think that, yeah, it's
yeah,
just really interesting, but
I think it
also
depends by the industry, because think about, for example, electric car m- make no sound, and for safety purposes now they are manufacturer of electric cars have to artificially create a sound that simulates a car, so that if
Yeah.
you're crossing the streets, you at least hear that there is a car coming behind you. So imagine the potential in that, like in having auditory marks, right?
Yeah. So you,
Which
which
are
currently exist.
unique to the, yeah, exactly, which are unique to the car producer, right? But instead of having just the sound of a car, I don't know, you have the Ferrari jingle, and you can only have that Ferrari
Yeah.
jingle if you're driving an electric Ferrari, and that would become again a form of association, no? Or and in a way they're already doing it even without the protection. If you go to Abercrombie and Fitch, the clothing brand, they are constantly spraying their perfume in the shop, and then has become such a
Yeah.
strong
And then
association between the perfume and the shop. The shop is known for that. So people have tried to do it, and it's really nice to see that the legal framework around granting protection to these forms of branding, if you want, has evolved and is accommodating these new trends. I think it's really interesting.
I think that's really good. And I think one of the next steps will be when using augmented realities, you go into Abercrombie and Fitch, and then you look through things and on the Abercrombie and Fitch filter,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's sort of you could have all sorts of things, or the sort of information wise that come to you. You could be like, this
Yes,
is that jacket's in your size. This
yes.
match the thing you bought last week.
It is produced ethically, like also all
Yeah,
of these things, like tracking using blockchain again to track it and
or
seeing where it comes from.
or even it could just show the store in a different way, and you'd see different
Yes,
sort of different artwork, or you'd see different
exactly, based on your tailored customization. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And that's what I think is really what is going to be really exciting,
I agree.
because
Imagine
then
going to someone home, like to a friend of yours, to play board game night, which of course in London is very popular to do. It's a nice way to catch up. You go in, and really without the glasses, without the technology, all you'd see would be like white frames. But then the moment you wear the technology, it customizes itself immediately based on your subjective preferences. Let's say you're a Manchester United fan, you start seeing all
yeah, I think,
artwork related to that, or you're a Da Vinci fan, you see the Mona Lisa and all of that.
yeah.
So it would be
And
a
so when
very different way.
somebody bought this was last year, they bought just a digital and this was done by a blockchain. Somebody bought a digital item of clothing
Yes, for ten
because
thousand, something crazy.
at auction or something, and you sort of think that why
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to see how fashion houses are influenced by that.
and there is
Because
a company which is very active in that space, and I recommend you to look at it. Which is, we discussed it, I think, Laxo. We had Marjorie, the CEO and founder, last episode, and they are moving into this space, into blockchain and fashion, and how digital, like some designer, some clothing designer now do not even deal with fabric anymore. They only specialize within the virtual space.
wow, yeah. So
Yeah,
you think that's great? That's mental, isn't it? You'd never have thought to do that. But then with the sort of the way the fashion shows have been, or the start of lockdown, the way that fashion shows went with a sort of totally digital fashion show, you think in a way that sort of makes sense. And I think the digital representation of sort of fashion has never been more important, um, because people want to see what it looks like at
yeah,
home, and that sort of that sort of brings up the the other set of sort of intellectual property issues which we mentioned previously, which is how do you capture the motion of people in augmented reality? Um, and the answer is you have to train a system using human motion and motion capture, and so you have to really look at or have a big pool of people doing a certain motion or carrying out certain actions, and then you train a system of artificial intelligence to sort of place that onto your item of fashion.
okay. Is it
And
sorry, I have a question about this
yeah,
point. Is it because, so when you mention motion capture, I assume it's the same that they're using now for video games and Hollywood production, right?
yeah,
So are those suits? So the thing, what you said about machine learning and having a large group of people reproducing the same movement in different ways, is that because
yeah,
basically the that would simulate the movement of the dress on you, or like of the shirt on you, based on
yeah.
like the similarity between your movement and someone else's? Is that
So I think that's one of the things that we'll see more and more of, I suppose, because you already have. I think it was ASOS who brought in, like, see this in your size or see this on
yes?
you, and so you can very easily tailor a still or a set of stills to see what the
Mhm.
dress would look like, But the next step is to, yeah, is to see it in is to see
Yeah,
it in
moving. How the
yeah, to see it
how
move.
the textile behave based on the movement based.
And for augmented reality, that's really important to sort of make things,
Real,
life.
yeah,
Yeah,
feeling, yeah, lifelike. That's really interesting. Ultimately, I think augmented reality. I read this book on augmented reality, which was saying, well, augmented reality really is the third interface that we'll have.
yeah,
So the first interface was line of code. Really, the first was the like the punched hole paper, but line of code, let's say. Second one really is the UI, user interface, which is what we are using now on the computer. And then he was arguing that the third iteration will be augmented reality, where the way we interface with information will be completely different. We will be able to effectively experience information, as we said, digital information, as if it was real. And then at that point you really start to blur the line as between what's real and what's not, because like if you are able to perceive it through your five senses, is that not real? The
yeah,
stimulation that you get in your brain, is the stress that you get when you have a problem at work not real? Bear in mind, it goes and stimulates the same areas of your brain that would be stimulated if you were running away from a tiger. It's the exact same thing. I was
yeah,
listening to an episode of Joe Rogan, which was very interesting, and was with a researcher, and they were saying that your brain does not understand the difference between having to run away from something to survive and some danger at work, or at least the response. I'm not saying the extent of the response, but the area of your brain that's being stimulated is the same. And you can already see that with virtual reality. People react. You have
yeah. Very, very
a
real way.
subconscious response, exactly, and you have a subconscious response. Even though if you know that it's fake, you do have an emotional response to it, and it's measured. They're measuring your heart rate, they're measuring all of that, so it's real. Like stimulation of
Yeah,
a sense does imply also a neurological response that make the experience almost real, at least.
yeah.
So
Well, so that's, I suppose the worrying point is where people prefer the augmented
yeah.
reality to real life,
Mm.
and sort of,
I
and
know,
that
well, that's the danger, yeah.
then that's when you really sort of start to question what would be real. But the yeah, I think we're I don't know. I think we're a little way off that at the moment, fortunately or unfortunately,
Yeah,
depending on.
hopefully. Yeah, exactly. Because if you look at it now, Elon Musk is talking about Neuralink and be able to have a third layer in the brain through which to communicate basically
Yeah,
instantaneously, so that we won't have to take the phone, insert the information, send, but it will be seamless between us. We'll be able to exchange thought in the form of images almost. That, imagine what the implication of that are going to be, especially,
IP, right? Yeah,
yeah,
that's gonna.
you want, yeah.
There's no such thing as confidential information at all, and
Yeah, imagine the risk of that if someone hacks that. And imagine, like, everyone see things, myself included, the augmented reality will be glasses. But if you have something in your brain that can directly stimulate your brain, so you won't even have to stimulate the senses, you'll go straight to the source, so to the brain, and you'll be able to directly stimulate and the brain. Imagine that. And if you couple it with, okay, now we're going, like, let's just allow ourselves to divert a moment, but to digress, sorry, not diverge, to digress a moment. But if you think about it, so the price, especially in cities, well, not now because of COVID, but right before COVID, the houses are becoming smaller, earth is becoming more cluttered. Now there is also concern about the environment, so traveling is discouraged in terms of like traveling by plane. Imagine what that would mean. Like, are we going to find ourselves 15 years from now, locked inside a cubicle, and our only form of escape will be augmented reality, and we won't be able to travel, and only the highest portion of flights would go up in price because less people would be using the service. What does that mean? That only very few people will be able to actually experience, traveling and seeing new places? And is that the case? I'm not sure.
yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know. I think it would yeah, be interesting to see how the technology, how sort of how much the technology is adopted,
Hmm.
and I suppose what we see at the moment is the sort of the greater adoption of more and more sort of invasive tech, invasive
Yes.
in a sort of